In the late summer of 1919, the fields of Phillips County, Arkansas, stretched wide beneath the southern sky. At first glance, life there seemed to follow the familiar rhythm of farm work and harvest, but beneath the surface, tension was quietly building. This was the year that history would later call the Red Summer, a time when communities across the United States faced unrest and fear. It was during these months that Phillips County became the setting for one of the most tragic and significant events in American history. The people who lived and worked the land in this corner of Arkansas were no strangers to struggle. Many were farmers bound to the soil, giving their strength and labor in exchange for a small share of the harvest. This system often left them trapped in a cycle of debt, working tirelessly without ever truly gaining freedom or stability. Yet despite the hardship, there was a quiet determination to build better lives for their families. As the days passed, the pressure of unfair treatment began to weigh heavily on the farmers. They sought something simple but powerful: justice, fairness, and a voice in shaping their future. This desire was not just about wages or crops, but about dignity, the right to live and work without fear of exploitation. In the midst of this, communities began to organize, gathering together in hopes of finding strength in unity. But unity, in those times, could be seen as a threat. Rumors spread easily, and fear quickly turned into suspicion. What started as quiet meetings filled with hope for fairer treatment soon drew the attention of outsiders who misunderstood, or perhaps did not want to understand, the true purpose behind these gatherings. Tension grew sharper, and whispers of unrest began to circle through the county. It was in this charged atmosphere that events unfolded, leading Phillips County into the pages of history. Families who had long endured hardship now faced something even greater: the shadow of violence and the weight of injustice. What happened here would not only scar the land but also shape conversations about freedom and fairness for generations to come. This story is more than just a historical account, it is a reminder of the struggles faced by ordinary people in extraordinary times. It speaks of courage, endurance, and the determination to stand for what is right, even when the odds seem overwhelming. As we look back, we honor those who lived through these events, and we reflect on the lessons their experiences continue to teach us today. If you find this story meaningful, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing for more untold histories, and sharing it with others who care about learning from the past. Together, we can keep these stories alive, ensuring that history is remembered, not forgotten. In the early years of the 20th century, in the cotton-rich fields of the American South, life for many farming families was marked by hardship. The land was fertile, the harvests plentiful, but for those who worked the soil day after day, prosperity seemed always just out of reach. Families labored from sunrise to sunset, their hands calloused, their backs bent under the weight of endless toil. Yet when the season ended, and the crops were weighed and sold, the promise of reward never came. At the heart of this struggle was a system that looked, on the surface, like an agreement of partnership. Farmers were allowed to cultivate land they did not own, and in return, they shared a portion of their harvest with the landowner. But this arrangement, often called sharecropping, was rarely fair. With every passing season, the farmers fell deeper into a web of obligation. The landowners controlled not just the land, but also the tools, the seeds, and the credit for supplies. When accounts were settled, the numbers always seemed to lean against the farmer, leaving families with little or nothing after months of work. For many, this cycle felt endless. Each year brought new hopes that maybe, this time, things would be different. Yet each year ended the same, with debts owed, promises broken, and the dream of independence slipping further away. Fathers and mothers watched as their children grew up knowing little more than labor and struggle, caught in the same pattern their parents could not escape. Still, within this hardship, there was resilience. The farmers held close to the belief that life could be better. They dreamed of owning their own land, of working for themselves rather than for someone else's profit. In conversations whispered at night, in meetings held quietly among neighbors, the same question returned again and again: how long could this continue? How much longer could they endure a system designed to keep them at the bottom? The frustration was not just about money. It was about dignity. To spend months under the burning sun, to raise cotton tall and strong, only to be told that one's work was worth almost nothing, this was not simply an economic burden, but an insult to human worth. The farmers knew the value of their labor. They knew that without their hands, the fields would not yield, the markets would not thrive, and the wealth that flowed through the region would never exist. Yet their role was ignored, their contribution dismissed, as if their sweat and sacrifice did not matter. Over time, this quiet resentment grew stronger. Families began to talk openly about fairness, about justice, about claiming a rightful share of what their hard work produced. They were not asking for luxury. They were not demanding more than they had earned. What they sought was simple, a chance to provide for their children, to escape the trap of endless debt, and to walk through life with their heads held high, free from the weight of exploitation. The landowners, however, held on tightly to their power. The system benefited them too greatly to let it slip away. They controlled not only the farmland but also the courts, the banks, and the local authorities. Complaints were dismissed, and those who spoke too loudly risked losing even the little they had. The imbalance of power was clear, and it was this imbalance that made the farmer's situation feel so desperate. But desperation can become determination. In small gatherings, by the glow of lantern light, farmers began to discuss ways to protect themselves. They realized that alone, each family was vulnerable. Together, they might find strength. They spoke of uniting, of standing side by side, of demanding fair treatment not as individuals but as a community. The idea was both simple and revolutionary: to organize, to raise their voices, and to be heard. This growing sense of solidarity carried with it a quiet hope. Perhaps, at last, the cycle could be broken. Perhaps their children could see a future not defined by debt and disappointment. The conversations that once ended in despair now ended in resolve. Change, they believed, was possible. Yet, beneath this hope lingered a sense of danger. Those who held power would not welcome challenges to their authority. The farmers knew this, but still they pressed forward, because the alternative, silence, submission, and continued suffering, was no longer bearable. They were tired of seeing their labor enrich others while their own families lived in poverty. They were tired of being denied a fair share of the very crops their hands had raised. And so, beneath the sweltering southern sun, in the cotton fields and humble homes of Phillips County, frustration slowly transformed into action. What began as murmurs of discontent grew into the first sparks of a movement. It was not born of anger alone, but of a deep desire for fairness, for recognition, for the simple right to live with dignity. The story of these farmers is not just about fields and harvests. It is about the human spirit, about the refusal to accept injustice as a way of life. It is about the courage to dream of something better, even when every force around you insists that things will never change. And it is this spirit, born in hardship, tested in struggle, that would soon shape the course of history in ways few could have imagined. In the quiet corners of Phillips County, where cotton fields stretched to the horizon, conversations began to take on a new tone. For generations, families had endured the same cycle: long months of labor, followed by the disappointment of meager returns, and the crushing weight of debt that never seemed to end. But in the early years of the 20th century, something was changing. People who had grown weary of silence started to imagine what could happen if they came together, if they stood not as isolated families, but as one unified voice. It was from this spark of determination that the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America came into being. To many, it was more than just an organization, it was a lifeline, a vision of a future where justice might finally outweigh exploitation. The union was not built in grand halls or offices, but in small gatherings held in homes, churches, and quiet meeting places. By lantern light, farmers and their families would sit close, listening intently as leaders spoke of fairness, of wages that reflected the true value of their labor, and of settlements that would no longer leave them empty-handed after a season of toil. The union gave words to feelings that had long been left unspoken. For years, individuals had grumbled quietly at their misfortune, believing they were alone in their struggles. But within these meetings, they discovered something powerful: they were not alone. Their neighbors, their friends, and even strangers who worked the same fields shared the same frustrations and the same hopes. The realization that so many carried the same burdens made the air in those rooms electric with possibility. What made the Union different was its boldness. It dared to envision a world where farmers could stand on equal footing when it came time to settle accounts. The dream was not one of wealth or extravagance, but of balance, receiving a fair share for honest work. Leaders of the Union taught that negotiation, not submission, was the key. They encouraged members to demand transparency in contracts and to resist the manipulations that kept them in perpetual debt. Families who joined the Union began to feel a shift in their lives. Where once there had been only resignation, there was now hope. Children would listen at the edges of meetings, their eyes wide, sensing that their parents were part of something larger than themselves. Mothers who had stretched every coin to feed their families found strength in the collective will of their community. Fathers who once returned from the fields weary and defeated now returned with renewed determination, inspired by the promise that their sacrifices might finally lead to change. The Union was not simply about wages, it was about dignity. To demand fairness was to declare that their lives had value, that their work mattered, and that they would no longer accept being treated as if their efforts were invisible. In every gathering, this idea was repeated like a vow: together, they could make their voices heard. But the strength of the Union was also its challenge. Its existence represented a shift in power, however modest, and power rarely shifts without resistance. Those who benefited from the old system watched its growth with unease. Whispers spread through the county that the farmers were becoming restless, that their meetings were more than just discussions of wages. To outsiders, the Union seemed to symbolize defiance. Yet for the members themselves, it was not about defiance at all, it was about survival, about the hope that their children might inherit something better than the endless grind of debt. Despite the risks, the Union grew. Word traveled from one farm to the next, from one household to another. Each new member strengthened the cause, adding another voice to the call for fairness. Meetings were filled with energy and resolve, as leaders outlined steps for negotiating with landowners and protecting one another from intimidation. These gatherings were more than strategy sessions, they were moments of solidarity, where weary workers left with a renewed sense of purpose. In the cotton fields the next morning, the conversations continued. While hands picked through the rows, the farmers spoke in low tones about the Union, about the courage it gave them, and about the possibility of change. Their voices carried a quiet strength, one born not of anger, but of determination. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America became a symbol of unity in a time of deep division. It embodied the idea that even those with the least power could find strength in numbers, that justice could be pursued not through silence, but through collective action. It represented the belief that life did not have to be dictated solely by those who held the land and the money, that those who worked the fields had a right to fairness, too. For the families who joined, the Union was more than a name. It was a movement, a promise, and a declaration that they would no longer endure injustice in silence. Though challenges lay ahead, and though the road was uncertain, the very act of organizing was itself a victory. It showed that even in the face of hardship, the human spirit could rise, dream, and unite in the pursuit of something greater. The last days of September in 1919 carried with them a heavy stillness in Phillips County. The cotton harvest was underway, the fields buzzing with the relentless work of hands pulling white bolls from their prickly husks. But while the land seemed unchanged, the atmosphere in the community was anything but ordinary. Farmers and their families had grown restless, their frustrations finding new focus in the meetings of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union. It was in those gatherings that they found courage, a sense of unity, and the promise of a fairer tomorrow. On the evening of September 30th, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the Arkansas soil, people began to make their way toward a small wooden church near a place called Hoop Spur. The church was modest, built with the care of those who relied on it not just for worship, but for community. That night, however, it was more than a house of prayer. It was a place where families gathered to discuss the Union's plans, to learn how they might finally secure justice in a system that had long been stacked against them. Inside, the air was thick with both hope and unease. Men and women filled the pews, their faces illuminated by lantern light. The mood was serious. Leaders spoke in steady voices, reminding everyone that unity was their greatest weapon, that only by standing together could they demand the fairness they deserved. The people listened intently, their eyes focused, their hearts pounding with the weight of possibility. But outside, danger lingered. Word of the meeting had spread beyond the community. Whispers had traveled through town, twisting the truth of the gathering into something threatening. To some on the outside, the sight of men and women meeting to assert their rights seemed like defiance. And so, that night, a small group of armed white men approached the church, their intentions unclear but their presence unmistakably hostile. Inside, those standing guard at the doors and windows knew the risks. They were not soldiers, not men seeking violence, but they understood the precariousness of their position. For too long, their families had been left vulnerable to intimidation. This time, they chose to protect their own, to stand as shields for the people gathered in faith and determination within the church walls. As the meeting continued, the quiet outside gave way to tension. Darkness cloaked the road, broken only by the faint glow of lanterns and the glint of gun barrels. The guards watched every movement carefully, their nerves stretched thin. No one inside the church yet realized how close the world beyond their doors had come to erupting. Then, in an instant, silence was shattered. A sudden exchange of gunfire split the night air, sharp cracks echoing across the fields. The stillness of the evening was gone, replaced by chaos and fear. Screams and shouts rang out, and the people inside the church dropped low to the floor as bullets cut through the wooden walls. The skirmish was brief, but its impact was immense. When the smoke cleared, one man lay dead, a security officer from the group that had approached the church. His fall marked not just the end of a moment, but the beginning of something far larger and far more tragic. Inside the church, fear gave way to confusion. The farmers had come seeking fairness through unity, but now they faced a new and terrible reality: a single night's violence would ignite a storm they could not contain. Outside, word of the shootout began to spread quickly, carried by voices eager to assign blame and stoke anger. For those who had gathered that night, the sound of gunfire at Hoop Spur was more than just an isolated event, it was the spark that would set their world ablaze. In the days to follow, the community would be thrust into chaos, the tragedy at the church serving as the catalyst for one of the darkest chapters in the region's history. But in that moment, on that September night, all anyone could feel was the weight of fear pressing down upon them. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Fathers braced for what was to come. The dream of justice that had filled the church only hours before now seemed fragile, threatened by forces far greater than their own determination. And so the night ended not with prayer or song, but with the echo of gunfire still hanging in the air, a sound that would forever mark the beginning of the struggle that followed. Hoop Spur, once a place of quiet faith, had become the stage for a turning point, one that would shape not only the lives of those present, but the memory of a nation grappling with the meaning of fairness, unity, and justice. In the hours following the deadly confrontation at Hoop Spur Church, the silence of the Arkansas countryside was pierced by whispers. At first, they moved quietly, carried from farm to farm, from road to roadside gatherings. But soon those whispers swelled into rumors, and rumors hardened into something far more dangerous. The story that traveled was not of farmers meeting to discuss fair wages, nor of families gathering in the hope of justice. Instead, the tale twisted into something alarming, a claim that an organized uprising was underway. To many in Phillips County, the very idea of such a movement set hearts racing with fear. The facts of the church meeting no longer mattered, what mattered was perception. The more the tale was retold, the more exaggerated it became. In the retelling, guards at the church became armed conspirators. A defensive gunshot became proof of an elaborate plan. Soon, it was no longer seen as an isolated clash, it was portrayed as the beginning of a sweeping insurrection. Fear has a way of moving faster than truth. By the time the sun rose on the following day, the narrative had spread well beyond the farms and fields of Elaine. In town centers and along country roads, voices spoke of danger, of chaos about to erupt, of neighbors needing to defend themselves. The countryside buzzed with urgency, and with every passing hour, more men answered what they believed was a call to arms. The gatherings began small, clusters of men with rifles slung across their shoulders, standing at crossroads and trading rumors like currency. But as word spread, those gatherings swelled. Local men were soon joined by others from surrounding areas, drawn not by evidence but by stories. The fear of an organized rebellion gripped them so tightly that reason was pushed aside. And then, others joined in. Vigilantes, men who had long looked for reasons to assert dominance, took the opportunity to act. They were not merely answering a call to protect their homes, they were fueled by something deeper, something that turned rumor into justification. They poured into Phillips County in groups, their weapons polished, their minds set on quelling a threat that had been more imagined than real. The local authorities, overwhelmed by the rapid spread of panic, turned to the federal government for support. Soon, uniformed troops arrived, their presence adding to the gravity of the moment. Where once there had been only a rural town with its own struggles, now stood a region bristling with rifles, soldiers, and the unease of thousands. For the families at the heart of the rumor, the sight of so many armed men descending upon their community was devastating. These were farmers, sharecroppers, mothers, and children, ordinary people whose greatest wish had been to find fairness in their daily lives. But as mobs assembled and troops marched in, they were cast in the role of enemies in a battle they had never sought. The sound of boots striking the ground, of wagons rolling through dusty roads, and of rifles cocking filled the air. It was as if the entire countryside had been transformed overnight into a battlefield. Yet, the battlefield was not born of rebellion, but of rumor. For those who lived through it, the days that followed blurred together in fear. Families fled their homes, hiding in the woods and fields, uncertain where safety might be found. Others were caught in the open, forced to endure the weight of suspicion cast upon them. The hope that had been nurtured in community meetings only days before now seemed a distant memory, replaced by the pressing need to survive. The arrival of troops might have offered a chance to calm the situation, to restore order with clarity and fairness. But in the fog of fear, their presence only intensified the scale of what was unfolding. Their mission was shaped not by the truth of the farmer's plight, but by the rumors that had swept across the land. And so, instead of quelling panic, the forces that gathered reinforced it, amplifying the chaos. What began as whispers had now transformed into a storm, one that threatened to consume everything in its path. The truth of the church meeting was drowned beneath waves of rumor and fear, and the people of Elaine found themselves at the center of a tragedy spiraling far beyond their control. The days ahead would bring violence and loss, leaving scars that would mark Phillips County for generations. Yet at the heart of it all lay a sobering reality, the power of rumor. What was born from whispers and fear had been given the weight of armies and the force of mobs. In this way, a quiet meeting in a wooden church became recast as an uprising, and a community already struggling for fairness was thrust into a nightmare it could never have imagined. And so, the events that unfolded in Elaine remind us of how fragile truth can be when overshadowed by fear, and how easily stories, once twisted, can ignite forces far greater than the people who first spoke them. The quiet countryside of Phillips County had always carried the familiar sounds of life, children playing, the rustle of wind across the fields, and the rhythm of farming that marked each passing season. But in the days following the outbreak at Hoop Spur, those sounds were swallowed by something darker. What began as rumors of unrest now spiraled into actions that would leave scars too deep to measure. Groups of armed men moved through the county with a sense of grim purpose. They did not come to ask questions or to seek truth. Instead, they arrived with rifles in hand and suspicion in their eyes. To them, the story of a supposed uprising had already been written, and every family, every farm, every face became part of that story, guilty without proof. Homes that once sheltered laughter and the warmth of evening meals suddenly stood in danger. Fires crackled against the night sky, casting long shadows over the fields. Families who had worked for generations to build even the smallest measure of security watched as their hard-won belongings disappeared in smoke and flame. There was no warning, no chance to plead for mercy. The violence that swept across the county did not distinguish between the strong and the weak, the old and the young. Men were hunted, women faced terror, and children who once played freely in the fields now clung to their mothers in fear. Entire households fled into the woods, hearts pounding with each sound that echoed from the distance. To survive meant to hide, to move silently through the underbrush, and to pray that the violence would pass by without noticing them. For those who were caught, there was little hope. The mobs acted with certainty, as if each act of destruction were justified by the rumors that had taken hold. They believed they were quelling a rebellion, when in truth, they were tearing apart communities that had sought nothing more than fairness and dignity. The difference between rumor and reality was lost in the haze of smoke and gunpowder. Eyewitnesses would later recall scenes that defied belief, neighbors turning on neighbors, homes reduced to ashes, lives cut short without reason. The land itself seemed to bear witness, as if the soil of Arkansas absorbed both the cries for help and the silence that followed. Fields that once promised harvest now carried the weight of tragedy. The scale of the violence grew quickly, stretching beyond the ability of anyone to count or comprehend. Some would later estimate that over 100 lives were lost, while others claimed the toll was even greater, perhaps 200 or more. The numbers, though debated, can never fully capture the depth of the loss. Behind each figure stood a person with hopes, with family, with a story cut short. In the chaos, survivors were left to piece together what little they could. Some returned to the ruins of their homes, sifting through ashes in search of anything that might be saved. Others never returned at all, carrying their grief into exile, too broken to remain on the land that had once been home. The violence did more than claim lives, it carved fear into the hearts of those who remained. For generations, the memory of those days would be passed down in hushed tones, carried like a burden too heavy to speak aloud. The survivors knew that the world outside might never fully understand the depth of what had been lost, but within their families, the pain endured. The tragedy of Phillips County was not simply in the destruction itself, but in how easily it had been justified by rumor and fear. A story had been told, of rebellion, of threat, and it had been believed so fiercely that it gave license to actions beyond comprehension. In the end, it was not truth that shaped the events, but perception, and perception proved deadly. As the smoke cleared and the mobs dispersed, the land bore witness to what had happened. The fields, the rivers, and the forests carried the memory in silence. The people who survived carried it too, etched into their lives forever. The community that had once gathered in hopes of fairness and unity was left scattered, its dreams buried beneath ashes and grief. Looking back, the tragedy of those days is not measured only by the number of lives lost, but by the extinguishing of possibilities. Each person taken was a voice silenced, a future stolen, a dream never realized. The county itself was left changed, its soil marked not just by farming but by the weight of sorrow. And yet, even in the shadow of such devastation, the memory of those who endured lives on. Their story continues to remind us how fragile peace can be, how dangerous rumor can become, and how deeply injustice can wound. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, carried forward not only in history books but in the quiet resilience of those who remember. The flames may have died, the mobs dispersed, and the fields planted once more, but the echoes of those days remain. They linger as both a warning and a call, to honor those who suffered, and to ensure that the silence of their voices is filled not with forgetfulness, but with remembrance. When the news spread that federal soldiers were on their way to Phillips County, many families still hiding in the woods and fields held on to a fragile hope. Surely, they thought, trained men in uniform would bring an end to the terror that swept through their community. The presence of the army was imagined as a shield, a force that would calm the mobs and bring back a sense of order. But when the troops finally arrived, that hope began to crumble in ways no one could have foreseen. Instead of standing as impartial guardians of peace, many of the soldiers took part in the very violence they were meant to stop. Their rifles did not remain at rest, and their arrival did not bring safety to those who prayed for it. On the contrary, the presence of federal power magnified the chaos. What had begun as mobs acting on rumor now carried the weight of official sanction, as soldiers joined the hunt with grim efficiency. Families who once believed the sight of uniforms meant protection soon learned otherwise. The landscape of Phillips County became a battlefield, and those caught in its path had no means to defend themselves. Machine guns, weapons of war, were turned against people who had no armies, no weapons to match such force. The sound of rapid fire echoed across the open fields, drowning out the cries of those who ran in desperation. For those in hiding, the terror grew beyond comprehension. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers tried to lead their families deeper into the forests, but the reach of the soldiers was long. Some survivors later remembered how the air itself seemed alive with gunfire, as if the earth was shaking beneath the relentless assault. There was no corner of the countryside that felt safe once the military pressed forward. The tactics used left not only lives destroyed but land devastated. Houses and barns that had stood for generations were burned, leaving only blackened shells against the horizon. Crops, the very lifeblood of the community, were trampled or set aflame. What could not be taken was left in ruin, as though the goal was not only to strike fear but to erase the possibility of recovery. It was not just about quelling supposed unrest, it became an exercise in domination, carried out with weapons and strategies designed for battlefields, not civilian farms. The fields of Phillips County, once a place of toil and quiet struggle, now bore the scars of military aggression. The landscape itself was transformed into a symbol of devastation, its wounds visible long after the troops departed. The weight of betrayal cut deeper than the physical destruction. Those who had hoped for protection now understood that authority could be just as dangerous as rumor. To see soldiers in uniform join in the destruction was to realize that the systems meant to ensure safety could also be turned against the most vulnerable. That knowledge would linger for years, etched into memory and passed down through generations. Witnesses would later recount the scale of devastation in hushed voices, as if speaking it aloud would awaken the terror again. The sound of machine guns tearing through the countryside became an unforgettable memory, a reminder that the promise of protection could collapse in an instant. Entire families vanished, their names surviving only through the stories of those who managed to escape. The arrival of federal troops was supposed to be a turning point, an end to violence. Instead, it became an extension of it, amplifying what the mobs had already begun. The difference was that this time, it was not just neighbors with rifles, it was soldiers with training, discipline, and weapons far beyond the reach of those they pursued. The imbalance was staggering, and the results devastating. In the aftermath, the scars left behind could not be counted only in lives lost. The land itself bore testimony to what had been unleashed. Fields once ready for harvest now lay barren, homes that had stood as symbols of family endurance were nothing more than smoldering ruins. Survivors faced not only grief but the impossible task of rebuilding from ashes. The story of those days reminds us how fragile trust can be. The people of Phillips County had placed their hope in the arrival of authority, believing it would bring justice and peace. Instead, they were met with the full weight of military force used against them, a force that cared little for truth or fairness. The betrayal deepened the wound, ensuring that the memory of those events would never fade. Even years later, the silence of the fields held the echoes of machine guns, the emptiness of burned-out homes spoke of lives interrupted, and the sorrow carried by survivors testified to the scale of loss. What was expected to be a moment of rescue became one of the darkest chapters in their story. The very presence of federal troops, far from calming the storm, had fueled it, leaving devastation in their wake. And so, the lesson lingers. Power, when turned against the vulnerable, can magnify suffering beyond measure. Authority, when unchecked, can become as destructive as the chaos it claims to end. For the people of Phillips County, the arrival of the troops was not salvation, it was a reminder that justice was still far away, and survival meant enduring even when every hope seemed lost. After the gunfire faded and the fields of Phillips County lay in ruin, the nightmare did not end. Instead, it shifted from violence in the open to the cold machinery of the courtroom and the jailhouse. What followed was a chapter that weighed just as heavily as the destruction itself, for it revealed how power could twist truth and bend justice until it was unrecognizable. In the days after the violence, scores of African American residents were rounded up. Men, women, and even the elderly were forced from their homes or dragged from hiding places, accused of crimes they had never committed. Shackled and marched into custody, they carried with them only fear and confusion. They had already survived the horror of bullets and fire, and now they faced something quieter but equally cruel, the crushing grip of a legal system designed not to protect them, but to condemn them. Inside the jails, the suffering deepened. Interrogations were not built on fairness or evidence but on intimidation. Survivors later recounted how prisoners were pressured, threatened, and in many cases physically abused until words were forced from their mouths, words that could be twisted into confessions. It was not truth the authorities sought, it was validation for the violence that had already taken place. Each coerced statement became a tool to justify what the mobs and soldiers had done, a way to rewrite the story so that the victims became the accused. The scale of arrests was staggering. Entire groups of men were held under suspicion, treated as though the simple act of surviving the violence marked them guilty. Families waited outside, desperate for news of loved ones, only to be met with silence or rumors of what was happening inside the jailhouse walls. The fear spread far beyond those locked away, for every resident of the community understood that innocence offered no shield. Among those imprisoned, 12 men would face the harshest fate. Known later as the Elaine 12, they became symbols of both injustice and resilience. Their trials were conducted with a swiftness that mocked the very idea of due process. Courtrooms filled not with impartial judges or fair-minded juries, but with men already convinced of guilt before a single word was spoken in defense. Lawyers appointed to represent the accused had little chance to prepare, and their voices were drowned out by the weight of prejudice that hung in the room. Witnesses brought forth were often unreliable, their stories shaped by fear or pressure. Yet their words were accepted as fact, while the voices of the accused were dismissed. It was a performance rather than a trial, a ritual meant to end with the verdict already written in the minds of those in power. Within days, 12 men stood condemned to die, not because of what they had done, but because of who they were and the fear they represented to the world around them. For the families of the Elaine 12, the verdicts were more than devastating, they were a theft of hope. Mothers wept for sons, wives feared for husbands, children clung to the fading memory of fathers they might never see again. Outside the courthouse, the community braced itself against another wave of despair, knowing that the same system could at any moment claim more lives with little more than a whisper of accusation. The injustice reached far beyond Phillips County. News spread, and voices from outside the region began to question the fairness of what had taken place. Yet for those trapped within the walls of their cells, relief felt distant, almost unimaginable. Each passing day brought the shadow of execution closer, the weight of the sentence pressing heavily on their shoulders. The 12 men waited, not knowing if the world would forget them or if anyone would fight to bring light into the darkness of their plight. What made this moment even more painful was the clear contrast between what justice was meant to be and what it had become. A courtroom, in theory, should be a place of truth and fairness, where evidence is weighed and innocence protected. But in Phillips County, it became another stage for oppression, a place where power was reinforced through fear and death sentences were delivered as if they were routine. The story of the Elaine 12 did not end with their sentencing. In time, their names would be remembered not only for the injustice they endured but also for the fight that would follow. Lawyers, activists, and organizations would rally to their defense, recognizing that their fate carried implications far beyond the walls of the jail. It was not simply about 12 men, it was about the soul of justice in America. But in those first days, when the verdict was read and the gavel fell, all that remained was despair. The people of Elaine were left to reckon with the fact that survival did not guarantee safety, and innocence did not secure freedom. The trials made clear that the violence was not confined to the fields and forests, it extended into the very institutions that claimed to uphold the law. Thus, the tale of the arrests and the sentencing of the Elaine 12 became a stark reminder that injustice wears many faces. It can arrive with fire and rifles, or it can wear a robe and wield a gavel. Either way, the result is the same: lives broken, hope threatened, and a community left struggling to endure in the face of overwhelming power. Hope, though faint, did not vanish after the harsh verdicts fell upon the Elaine 12. Even as despair settled heavily across Phillips County, whispers of resistance and determination began to grow. These whispers soon transformed into voices, and those voices into a movement that reached far beyond the cotton fields of Arkansas. The fate of 12 men, unjustly condemned, was about to ignite a struggle that would echo through the highest court in the nation. It began with individuals who refused to look away. Among them was Ida B. Wells, the fearless journalist and activist who had long dedicated her life to exposing injustice. To her, the plight of the Elaine 12 was not an isolated tragedy but part of a larger pattern of abuse that demanded exposure. Wells understood that truth, when told loudly and persistently, could pierce through the silence that so often protected oppression. She traveled, she spoke, she wrote, and she carried the story of these 12 men into the public eye with unwavering conviction. At the same time, the NAACP, still young but already a growing force for justice, recognized that the Elaine case represented more than a regional conflict. It was a test of whether America's courts could truly deliver fairness when fear and prejudice poisoned the air. Leaders within the organization raised funds, gathered allies, and built the groundwork for a legal battle that would stretch over years. They knew the odds were steep, yet they also knew that without such a fight, the cycle of injustice would only deepen. Central to this effort was a lawyer named Scipio Africanus Jones, a man whose sharp mind and unshakable resolve would prove vital. Born to formerly enslaved parents, Jones had risen against all odds to become one of Arkansas's most skilled attorneys. To him, the defense of the Elaine 12 was not only professional duty but also personal mission. He saw in their struggle the reflection of a broader battle for dignity and fairness, one he was determined to pursue with every tool at his disposal. Jones began the painstaking work of appeals, drafting arguments, and navigating a legal system designed to resist him at every step. His task was daunting: to prove that the trials which condemned the Elaine 12 were not true trials at all but mere performances orchestrated by fear, intimidation, and the sway of the mob. Each motion, each document, was crafted with care, for he understood that he was not only speaking for 12 men but also challenging the very foundation of justice in America. The path wound slowly upward, through state courts and obstacles meant to delay and exhaust the defense. Yet Jones and his allies pressed forward, never abandoning the hope that higher courts might finally hear what lower courts refused to acknowledge. Alongside legal arguments, public pressure mounted, carried forward by Wells and the NAACP. Speeches were delivered, articles published, and funds gathered to sustain the long and costly campaign. At last, the case made its way to Washington, D.C., into the chambers of the U.S. Supreme Court. The stakes could not have been higher. Before the justices stood not only the question of whether 12 men had been wrongfully sentenced but also whether America's promise of due process had any real meaning when tested by fear and violence. The case, Moore v. Dempsey, was argued in 1923. Scipio Jones, together with NAACP lawyers, presented the truth, that the trials in Phillips County had been dominated not by fairness but by mobs who threatened violence if guilty verdicts were not delivered. Witnesses had been coerced, juries intimidated, and the outcome predetermined before the first gavel struck. If such proceedings could be called justice, then justice itself was an illusion. The courtroom in Washington carried none of the chaos of Phillips County, yet the weight of the moment was undeniable. Here, in the heart of the nation's legal system, the voices of the Elaine 12 were finally being heard, not through forced confessions, but through the determined advocacy of those who believed in their humanity. When the decision came, it was a turning point. The Supreme Court ruled that trials dominated by mobs and intimidation violated the due process guaranteed by the Constitution. For the first time, the highest court in the land recognized that fairness demanded more than formality; it demanded freedom from fear, coercion, and violence. The ruling did not erase the pain already endured, but it cracked open a door that had long been sealed shut. For the Elaine 12, the ruling meant the possibility of life where death had loomed. For Scipio Jones, Ida B. Wells, and the NAACP, it was a vindication of years of relentless struggle. And for America, it was a signal, however faint, that the courts could, under pressure, rise to challenge injustice rather than reinforce it. The journey from a rural church meeting in Arkansas to the marble halls of the Supreme Court was long and harrowing, but it revealed a truth that continues to resonate. Even in the darkest times, determined voices can bring light. The story of Moore versus Dempsey became more than a legal precedent, it became a symbol of resistance, showing that courage and persistence could reshape the course of history. And though the ruling did not end the long shadow of inequality, it offered hope to generations that followed, that when truth is carried with courage, it can climb all the way to the highest court and demand to be heard. The story of Elaine is not one that fades easily from memory. It lingers like an echo, a reminder of both the pain of injustice and the resilience of those who dared to resist it. The massacre in 1919 revealed a truth that many wished to bury, that entire communities could be uprooted and terrorized not for crimes committed, but for daring to demand fairness. Men and women who tilled the soil with their bare hands, who asked only for just compensation for their labor, found themselves caught in a storm that stripped away lives, homes, and futures. And yet, even amid devastation, a flicker of hope endured. That hope was not born of naive belief, but of determination, the determination of lawyers like Scipio Jones, the courage of activists like Ida B. Wells, and the persistence of organizations like the NAACP. Their work carried the story of the Elaine 12 from a courthouse clouded by intimidation to the marble halls of the Supreme Court, where the nation was forced to confront whether justice could truly exist when poisoned by fear and bias. The ruling in Moore versus Dempsey did not erase the suffering that had come before, but it carved out a new path, a precedent that future generations could lean upon. In this way, the Elaine Massacre became more than a tragedy. It became a marker in history, a moment that revealed the depths of cruelty, but also the possibility of transformation. It showed how ordinary farmers, struggling for fairness, could spark a movement that touched the very core of American law. It showed how voices that refused to be silenced could alter the course of justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. The story stands as a dual symbol. On one side, it is a stark reminder of how systems of power can turn against the vulnerable, how rumors and fear can spiral into destruction. On the other side, it is a testament to the strength of resistance, to the belief that even the most broken circumstances can plant seeds of change. Those seeds did not fully bloom in 1919, nor in 1923, but they took root. Decades later, as the civil rights movement gathered force, the legal foundation built in part by Elaine's legacy provided strength and guidance for the battles ahead. When we look back now, the Elaine Massacre is both a wound and a milestone. It calls us to remember the lives lost, the families broken, and the communities scarred. But it also challenges us to recognize the victories that followed, the gradual dismantling of barriers, the slow but steady march toward greater fairness under the law. In remembering Elaine, we are reminded that history is not only about suffering, it is about the courage to confront that suffering and insist on something better. Stories like these are not easy to hear, yet they are necessary. They allow us to connect the struggles of the past with the challenges of the present, to see how far we have come and how far we still must go. They remind us that progress is rarely born of comfort, it is born of sacrifice, persistence, and an unwavering demand for truth. As this story draws to a close, let it not be just an account of sorrow, but also an invitation, to reflect, to learn, and to carry forward the lessons of those who lived through it. For in their struggle lies a message that still matters today, that justice, though delayed and resisted, can be claimed when people refuse to give up. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of the importance of remembering history and honoring those who fought for fairness, I invite you to support this journey of storytelling. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that more voices from the past can be heard and preserved. And now, as we close this chapter together, may you carry these reflections with you into the night. May they remind you of resilience, of courage, and of the hope that even in darkness, light can be found. Sleep well, and good night.